All right, we're picking back up in our look at American Presbyterian history. Thank you again for being here this morning. And last week we ended our time right at the beginning of the 19th century, and we are going to pick back up where we left off, try to get as much of the 19th century done as we can. I've given up all of my plans for how we're going to work through this. I've just thrown that out, and I'm going to talk about everything that we need to talk about, that I think we need to talk about, and it'll take as long as it takes, and we'll just do it that way. I also have this whiteboard right here, and if it doesn't make sense, this is what we're going to be working through. So if it doesn't make sense, that's okay. But this is a timeline of American Presbyterian history. This is not an exhaustive timeline of all the major events and all the different branches that come from this main line of the Presbyterian Church, but this will give you a good sense of where we've been and where we're going. So just a quick recap to explain all this. And if you can't see this, please grab a picture of it, come up, take a picture of it after the class. But this is what we did a few weeks ago. We started in 1706, the first presbytery of the Presbyterian Church, and we basically went through this whole top line here, going through the major events, the Old Side, New Side split and reunion, up to the General Assembly in 1789. And we finished discussing that and made it to 1801 with the Plan of Union that was established in 1801. And going on during these time periods, we have the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening as the important context behind everything going on in the church at this time. So, with all that said, my plan is, again, that I'll talk for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then we'll have some time for clarifying questions, any other questions and discussions at the end of the class. So let's pick back up with the 1801 Plan of Union, and we'll talk about the Second Great Awakening and all that's happening during this time. So the 1801 recap of the Plan of Union, if you remember from last week, this was an agreement between the Presbyterian Church and the Congregationalists, and they made this plan to work together to supply ministers and plant congregations among all the settlers that were now moving west in this new nation that was just been formed around the same time. This allowed congregational churches to call Presbyterian ministers and vice versa. And it allowed for church leadership, whether it's in a Presbyterian form or in a congregational form, both of those would be recognized at the higher courts of either church. So for Presbyterians, that meant that congregational leaders, even those who might not be ordained or in any kind of recognized capacity, yet because they have leadership in that church, they would then have full right to voice their opinion and to vote on matters at presbytery and synod levels. So we mentioned last week, and it bears repeating, that this plan was put into effect, no doubt with good intentions, to try to supply these churches and these people as they're moving and settling into the West. There are good intentions, but the issues with this plan in 1801 became apparent almost immediately. The differences in church government were just too large to overcome. And there are significant differences in theology that would ultimately cause division. And that's where we're going to get to here in this kind of confusing part of the board. But that's where we're going. All of these issues, though, they're going to converge around the revivalism that is beginning to sweep across the nation during what's referred to as the Second Great Awakening. So we need to talk a bit about these Great Awakenings and the revivalism that's taking place. So in contrast to the First Great Awakening, led by figures like George Whitefield, and we talked about the Tenets and the Log College and those groups and those people, this second, and I'm going to refer to it as the Second Great Awakening, second so-called Great Awakening, because there's differences between the two, they're markedly different. And there's two examples that come out of the Second Great Awakening that demonstrate these differences all around this time period. So the early 1800s up to the 1830s. All of this we're talking about is part of this period of time. So two examples that will explain some of the differences between the second to the first Great Awakening are the Cane Ridge revivals that take place, and groups that come out of that, like the Cumberland Presbyterians. We're going to talk about them. And then the second example is Charles Finney. We're going to talk about Finney. So first, part of this awakening movement, the revivalism movement, is something that takes place in Cane Ridge. Cane Ridge was a Presbyterian church in Kentucky led by Barton Stone, and maybe you are familiar with that name. This revival took place in 1801, right around this time, and this was part of the Presbyterian church there, but Baptists, Methodists, other groups were all involved, and there was a lot of excess that was happening during this revival. Several excesses like shaking. It's where the groups like the Kentucky Shakers come from, and barking, and all these kinds of things were part of this mass group that was happening. So I have some books up here. You can come take a look at some of these books. I've mentioned them previously. One of those books by D.G. Hart, he records the testimony of one of the spectators at this Cane Ridge revival. Quote, "I saw at least 500 swept down in a moment, as if a battery of 1,000 guns had been opened upon them, and then immediately followed by shrieks and shouts that rent the very heavens." So that's an eyewitness testimony of this Cane Ridge revival. This revival was the birthplace of the Restoration movement and what has become the modern Christian church or Churches of Christ movement that you might be familiar with. They spread all throughout, especially the Midwest, but we have the presence of them here in this part of the country, very popular. We have just up on Main Street, Ozark Christian College, which is from this Restoration movement, which is also referred to as the Stone Campbell movement. You have Barton Stone, one of the first leaders of this movement, and Alexander Campbell as well. So that's where some of these groups come from that are wanting to restore the churches back to its early New Testament roots. That was their goal, and they're going to get rid of all names and nomenclature. We're not going to be called Presbyterians. We're not going to be called Baptists. We're just going to be called Christians because that's who we are. Or we're going to be called disciples of Christ, and that's why you see all these churches around the area that might be disciples of Christ or Christian churches or churches of Christ. And we don't have time to get into some of the irony of how even those groups splintered amongst themselves and have various different names that are all somewhat confusing. But that's where that movement comes from. Along with this movement is another group that were the Cumberland Presbyterians. This group also sprung up. This was a group of ministers also in Kentucky who were either part of that Cane Ridge revival in 1801 or were very favorable to it and to this kind of revivalism. And these churches began to grow quickly. New ministers were added so that a new presbytery was established in Kentucky called the Cumberland Presbytery. So that's where they come from, and that was in 1802. But it turned out that many of the ministers that were being licensed and ordained in this new presbytery, they didn't have any formal education. They didn't have any formal training, and they were taking exceptions to basic tenets of doctrine and Reformed theology, doctrines like God's sovereignty, doctrines like God's predestination, just core aspects of our faith. So this presbytery, complaints are being raised to synod and the General Assembly. This presbytery was initially disbanded because of this, but the General Assembly then it ultimately reconstituted the Cumberland Presbytery in 1810, but nothing had really changed. They kept ordaining the same kind of ministers with similar exceptions. By 1813, they had grown to 60 congregations, and at this point, they established their own synod, and unofficially, they became independent. And at that time, they also revised the Westminster Standards, this Cumberland Synod themselves, and took out language or changed language about predestination, about sin, and about some other doctrines as well. They officially became a separate church in 1825, and they would later rejoin the Northern Church when we get to 1906, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we get to that. But so here, I don't have them up on the board, but around this time, we're already seeing some other splinter groups and other branches forming and taking shape because of this revivalism. So from these new splinter groups, we have the Restorationists, the Stone Campbell movement. They discarded the creeds and confessions completely. And we have the Cumberland Presbyterians who seriously revised the confessions to fit their theological beliefs. we see some of the distinct differences between these revivals that were taking place now versus the revivals that took place in the First Great Awakening in the century prior. So Ian Murray, he wrote a very helpful book called Revivals and Revivalism, and he's distinguishing between these two things. He does an excellent job demonstrating that these are really two different movements. What is happening in the 1800s is not revival as such, but it's a new movement that should be called revivalism. Because the emphasis turns out to not be on God working providentially through the ordinary means of His Word and Sacrament to bless His church and to bring revival. That was certainly the case in the First Great Awakening. But now, revival has become something that's manufactured, and it's something that's full of excess and full of disorder. So Ian Murray provides a helpful warning about revival. He says that in times when it seems as though almost whole communities are entering into the kingdom of God, time must elapse before a more balanced assessment can be made. And he says, in all revivals there are admixtures. And he's referring even to the First Great Awakening there was some excess, but by and large we saw a lot of people coming to faith, churches growing and swelling. But he's giving a warning here that in all revivals, and especially as we get to the 1800s and this revivalism taking place, there's a lot of excess, there's a lot of admixtures, there's a lot of stuff being added that doesn't belong properly to God working sovereignly to bring revival. So he goes on and Murray says it cannot be supposed that in the high excitement attending a work of the Spirit of God, that God's saving work can be instantly distinguished from what moves men only temporarily or from what can be accounted for in psychological terms. So he's saying that there's psychology that's happening. There's human stuff that's happening. It might not necessarily be the work of God, and time will tell. And that's why we need to have strong foundations in Scripture and in theology to try to understand the differences here. So we'll talk a bit more about that when we get to Charles Finney, who is the other main example of this kind of revivalism that's taking place. But before we get to Finney, we do need to give an update on what's going on at Princeton. So I mentioned Princeton last week, and during this time, with these revivals, with all these unqualified ministers that are being ordained in several presbyteries, all the excess that was happening, the degradation of core theological principles, there's an obvious need for a more robust theological training for ministers. And in 1812, the General Assembly formed Princeton Theological Seminary for the explicit purpose of training pastors for gospel ministry. Now, this new seminary was different from Princeton College. Princeton College was established first as the College of New Jersey back in 1746. And the mission of that college has slowly changed over time as it was graduating more and more students who would go on to serve in public office, to serve in other capacities in other areas, but not necessarily in gospel ministry. So the Presbyterian Church saw the need for a seminary. And at this time, seminaries were primarily within the Catholic Church for training their clergy. But in this Protestant Presbyterian context, they saw the opportunity to adapt that model for their own purposes, and they started Princeton Seminary in 1812. So here I have some dates for how the College of New Jersey was established during this time, moved to Princeton, and now as we move into here, it's going to have a seminary now established for the training of ministers. Some important names to know: Archibald Alexander was the first and only professor of Princeton Seminary for 1 year in 1812. 1813, they added Samuel Miller, who taught on ecclesiology and church government. 1822, they added Charles Hodge, and he taught the biblical languages and Old and New Testaments. And Hodge will be very important as we go through this history. In the years leading up to this major split in 1837, there's going to be a lot of other seminaries that are founded during this time. And as we get into, and we'll explain the terms here, old school and new school, seminaries are going to be founded for the training of ministers. And depending on who's founding them and which presbyteries or synods are overseeing them, these seminaries are going to be either old school affiliated or new school affiliated. And so several, around 6 or so, seminaries are founded. The important ones to know, there's an Auburn Theological Seminary that's founded in New York. There's also 2 Union seminaries that are founded. There's Union Theological Seminary in Richmond, Virginia. That's still there today. And you can go and take classes there if you want, and all these schools actually. There's also Union Theological Seminary, also in New York. And those are important ones to know, even at this time, these old school, new school factions, which we'll explain in a moment, as they're emerging, these seminaries would really side with one or the other. So we have Union in Virginia, in Richmond, an old school institution. We have Union and Auburn in New York, which would be new school institutions. So we'll get to those in a moment. But that's part of what's happening during this time. All right, now let's talk about Finney for a little bit. And how am I doing on time? There's never enough. There's never enough time. So Charles Finney, Sean Lucas summarizes, by the time of the late 1820s, a new revivalist came to the forefront in the Northeast, symbolizing for many much that was going wrong within Presbyterianism. Charles Finney, that's the guy. In 1822, Finney came under care of the Presbytery of St. Lawrence, and he studied under a man named George Gale. George Gale was a very new Princeton Seminary graduate. But he did not recommend Finney study at Princeton. Finney would later observe that seminaries were defective because they did not train their graduates to, quote, be fit to go into a revival. So right away, you're seeing some of Finney's emphases here. Finney replaced his mentor Gale in 1823 at the church there. And at Finney's licensure exam, the presbytery asked him if this is what they asked all their licentiates or people up for ordination, do you receive the Westminster Confession? Is this what you believe? And here's what Finney said. He replied that he had never examined it, quote, with any attention, but he did receive it, quote, for the substance of doctrine, so far as I understand it, end quote. And he was ordained. And this episode really demonstrates the theological laxity of the time and how different presbyteries had very different standards. And what we'll see is even Finney's predecessor, Finney himself, their beliefs were not in line with Westminster, but were very much closer to a new wave of theology that was coming out of New England. We're going to talk about that in a moment. In 1824, then, I have that date up there, Charles Finney, that's when he was ordained. He is called to be an itinerant evangelist, and he would become one of the most influential figures in all of American history, certainly in this century. One of the most, you can't understate, or overstate rather, how important he is to the history, not just of the church, but of the country. So similar to how the First Great Awakening in America in the previous century really centered around the work of George Whitefield, the same is going to be true of Finney in this 19th century Second Great Awakening. He's going to be the figurehead. Finney was very famous for his new measures in his revival meetings. This is some of the manufactured revivalism that we mentioned earlier that Murray warns us about. And one of the major ones he had was the anxious bench. This was the precursor to the altar call. If you're feeling anxious, if you're feeling move of the Spirit, you need to come down to the front here. This led to a lot of drama, and almost immediately, what he's doing here, the anxious bench, some other things he did, these new measures, immediate admission of converts into church membership. There's really no interview process. These long nightly meetings full of excess. There's drama almost immediately, and in 1827, some presbyteries and other ministers gathered together to talk through these new measures. But at that meeting, Finney really won them over. And it was at that moment that he became the primary leader of this new revivalist movement. And And D.G. Hart, he argues that Finney's revivalistic measures, again, the anxious bench, maybe the most prominent, he says that these measures weren't primarily the worst issue, but he says that where Finney would draw the most fire was over a theory of revivals that flew directly in the face of Westminster Standards Calvinism. And that leads us to a discussion of Finney's theological beliefs and his relationship to the New School, which is also part of this broader movement that's happening that's sometimes referred to as New England theology and New Divinity theology or New Haven theology. So various terms describing a similar kind of movement with some differences, and we'll talk about some of those things as well. But Sean Lucas, he argues that Finney really represented this emerging New School movement in the Presbyterian Church in four ways. One way was Finney's belief in a manufactured revivalism. So Finney, quoting Lucas here, Finney quite boldly proclaimed that revivals were not due to the miraculous outpouring of God's Spirit, but simply the result of the proper application of means. So Finney's saying, no, you can have revival. You guys are just doing it wrong. But you can do what I'm doing, and you'll get results, right? This is quite opposite from even the New Side movement of the prior century, where even those guys, like Gilbert Tennant and others, they saw the need of God providentially working through his means that he's appointed to bring about revival. That's not what's happening here. All these people believe this is the work of God alone. Here's where we get into, with Finney and others, this is something that we are able to accomplish through the proper use of the means that we have, not the means that God has given and only He promises to bless. So that's one of the major issues emerging in this New School movement. A second issue that Finney epitomized was a radical kind of interdenominational ecumenicism. So Finney was very willing to work across denominational boundaries. We'll talk about that more in a moment. A third thing was Finney's revivalism that was tied itself to very specific social causes and social reform. So this was the temperance movement during this time, but also especially divisive was the issue of the abolition of slavery, which we'll discuss later in this class or maybe next time we're together. But we will discuss that at some point. And fourth, and most importantly, Finney's adoption of this new divinity, this New England theology that I talked about. And we'll talk about that in a moment here. This New England theology that was developing and is emerging, and this was emerging from New England, from Jonathan Edwards, which you remember is a First Great Awakening figure. Jonathan Edwards' disciples, primarily Samuel Hopkins and Nathaniel Taylor, are two figures that are taking what Edwards, his work, and now they're moving. They're taking it and they're putting it into their own theological frameworks. So it's beginning to develop, and this New England kind of theology is beginning to develop more. So Hart, he agrees with Lucas. He says that Finney's theological convictions were not his own. They were in fact part of the emerging theological consensus in New England Congregationalism. So I've mentioned a lot of names and terms here. So there's the New School within the Presbyterian Church. There's also this New England theology, which would develop into this New Divinity. We also talked about New Haven theology. We talked about names like Hopkins and Taylor, who are attached with Charles Finney. What do all of these folks have in common? And what are all these new things? How do these all relate to the revivalism that's taking place, and how does all of it ultimately lead us to this split in 1837? That's where we're going. So let's look at this New England theology. I know it's a lot, so bear with me, and if you have questions, we'll have some time to ask them here in a few moments. So New England theology is the name given to the descendants of Jonathan Edwards amongst the congregational churches in New England. And this theological system would continue to develop into New Divinity. It's taught by Samuel Hopkins and New Haven theology taught by Nathaniel Taylor. He's a professor at Yale in New Haven, so that's where that name comes from. So you have the larger bucket of New England theology that now gets distilled into these two figures, Hopkinsianism, New Divinity. You have Nathaniel Taylor from New Haven, from Yale, and his New Haven theology. So these new theological systems that are developing among the congregational churches in New England. Remember, Edwards was a Congregationalist minister. And this second generation now, Hopkins and Taylor, they're the same. So what does this have to do with the Presbyterian Church? Well, do you remember what happened in 1801? Because of the connection between Presbyterians and Congregationalists, not just a formal established union between the two, these New Haven and New Divinity theological ideas are beginning to have a lot of sway, and they're infiltrating into the Presbyterian Church. And those within the Presbyterian Church are adopting some of these beliefs, and those folks are also generally in line with some of what Finney believes and his new measures and new revivalism. So all of this is culminating and bubbling up into this new school movement within the Presbyterian Church. So we have this emerging new school movement within the church. It's embracing Finney's revivalism. It's embracing the New Divinity and sometimes New Haven theological system coming from the Congregationalist churches. This is a brewing problem over these early decades, these first 3 decades of the 1800s. In response to this, an old school side or party within the church is beginning to emerge. Ministers and churches that are wanting to defend the historic Reformed orthodoxy that's contained in the Westminster Standards. Princeton Seminary is going to be the bulwark of this old school movement. So I've mentioned a lot of the history, but what exactly did the New Divinity and New Haven teach, and how are both of these new things different from Westminster? So I'll offer a few examples of some of the differences here. We have the old school Westminster teaching. New Divinity tends to be somewhat of a nuanced, trying to be slightly more progressive, but not all the way. New Haven is the more progressive of the two new, but both of these they're departing from the Westminster Standard. So some key differences. Old school belief in the sovereignty of God and salvation. Core teaching of Scripture and of our standards. The New Divinity folks, they wanted to add some nuance to it. They wanted to emphasize the human agency, which again, a common misunderstanding is that people think we don't believe in free will. We do believe in free will, but God is ultimately free, and our free will is bound by sin. Well, New Divinity started to nuance that a little bit to emphasize the human aspect of it, especially in their idea of revivalism. Well, New Haven took it even farther, and they said, well, God doesn't coerce at all. They're entering into their concept of original sin, a kind of Pelagian understanding of original sin, that we are not totally depraved, but we are able to seek after the good in and of themselves. God's election. We believe in unconditional election, that God elects us before the foundation of the world, before any of us do anything good or bad. New Divinity, New Haven began to employ an Arminian understanding of the foreknowledge of God, that God would look down the corridor of time, that He would see who would freely choose Him, and those are the ones whom He elects in Christ. Our guilt in Adam. Because Adam sinned, and we are in Adam, as our federal head, we incur the guilt of Adam for sin. And because we are sinners, we then go and also sin. Well, New Divinity and New Haven theology would say, no, we are not guilty in Adam. Yes, we do sin, but again, they're adopting a Pelagian kind of understanding where it's not because we have been made guilty or we received Adam's guilt. That wouldn't be fair. God wouldn't do that. So they misunderstand the idea of original sin and want to emphasize what the person is doing, the personal choice. It's very important. Other topics like the atonement, where you have a very clear Christ is our substitute for sin, and He bears our penalty, the penal substitutionary theory or doctrine of the atonement. Well, here they're wanting to get away from that Christ did not die for sins, but Christ died as an example of God's love and what he wants his people to do. Or that Christ died in order to provide forgiveness, but without a direct payment for sin. So they're employing some other theories of the atonement. They broadened the atonement. It was a universal atonement, whereas we would understand it as a particular atonement. God in Christ died for his people and his people alone. And those people for whom he died, he will save. A lot of other things like that come up. Hopefully that gives you an idea. So really, Taylor's views, perhaps the most dangerous in the group. Those are the New Haven ideas. New Divinity still very dangerous and moving in dangerous directions, denying biblical beliefs about original sin, about total depravity, about God's sovereignty in salvation. So one quote here, Taylor believed that the depravity of the human heart was the result of one's own choices. So there is no inherent guilt in Adam, and we are able, we are free from that stain of original sin. So many Presbyterian ministers, because of this connection here, a lot of them are graduating from Yale. A lot of them are learning from Nathaniel Taylor. So these issues become very prominent. Finney adopted a lot of these theological beliefs. And because of all of this, tensions are becoming very, very high. I want to mention just two other figures, and then we'll stop for questions. So two other important figures that are leading up to this split are Robert Barnes and Lyman Beecher. So Barnes preached a sermon in 1831 that was later published called The Way of Salvation. And in it, he's making the same kind of points about new divinity, that Adam's guilt is not inherited to his posterity, that Christ did not die for his elect, but for all people. But he was never tried, or he was tried, but never convicted of this false teaching. Lyman Beecher he received charges also in the 1830s over some of his beliefs. He's well-known New England pastor. He served a Presbyterian church before going to a congregational church in Connecticut, and he also would serve at the historic congregational Park Street Church in Boston. I mentioned that in previous classes. He was father of Henry Ward Beecher, famous evangelist, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. So he's very influential in this time period as well. But like many of the New School folks, he was also involved in the temperance movement. He was actually the founder of the American Temperance Society. And so all of this is all wrapped up into one thing, really. The New School, social reforms, New Divinity / New Haven theological beliefs. So in response to all of this, all these issues that were coming up, this old school movement really began to grow in the 1830s in the Presbyterian Church. And it was in the context of challenging the New England theology that the terms old school and new school came into usage as two distinct parties in the church. Finney, he'd eventually leave the church, the Presbyterian Church, before this split happened. He left in 1835. He would settle in Ohio. He became a professor there, and he did not miss the Presbyterian Church at all. And I love this quote just because it's fitting of what he believed. So he said, "No doubt there is a jubilee in hell every year about the time of the meeting of the General Assembly." That's what Finney thought about the Presbyterian Church. So we have these two schools. Again, they refer largely to the larger movements that are happening. They're two schools of thought, as it were. They're not necessarily tied to specific institutions. However, like I mentioned, two major institutions that will be very important as we go through. One of them will be Union Seminary in New York, and the other will be Princeton in New Jersey, Princeton Seminary. So Union will be New School affiliated, Princeton will be Old School affiliated. So with all that understanding and that background in mind, we're now ready to get into the split that happened in 1837, but we'll have to wait until next time to do that. So we'll have to end it there, but I'll open it up to questions, and thank you guys so much for listening and paying attention, and yeah, I'll open up to questions here.